afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world at the moment. My name is James Rischbieth and I'm a research fellow here at the Leuven Institute of Criminology. And I'm joined by Professor Stephan Parmentier.
Indeed, I'm Stephan Parmentier, Professor of Human Rights and Criminology at the Faculty of Law and Criminology at KU Leuven in Belgium.
Absolutely, and we're joined today by a very special guest, Dr. Ram Bhandari, who is a visiting scholar here at the moment, an international scholar in Leuven. And it's a real honour to be here with Ram today because he is truly aware of many hats within our field of study. Not least an academic. He's a grassroots activist in Nepal, and he's a leader and pioneer in local, national and international civil society movements which seek justice for victims and survivors of serious human rights abuses. Academically, Ram is an expert on a raft of victims' issues, transitional justice and enforced disappearances in particular. He recently attained his PhD in 2023 from the INOVAS School of Law in Lisbon in Portugal, where he studied the role of victims' movements in transitional justice processes globally, with a focus on enforced disappearances. Now, Ram the academic coexists with Ram the civil service expert. He's a founding member of the International Network of Victims and Survivors of Serious Human Rights Abuses, known more colloquially as INOVAS, which is a network which is really without parallel. And we're looking forward to hearing more about the network from Ram today. He also has his own personal story, which has spurred his tireless activism at seeking justice for victims and survivors from the grassroots community level in Nepal to the national stage with the National Network of the Families of the Disappeared and Missing in Nepal, and the National Network of Victims and Survivors of Serious Human Rights Abuses, and of course, globally with INOVAS. So it's a very, very special visitor that we have with us here today. And Ram, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, James.
How did you get involved in this field of inquiry and field of activism and field of academia?
So it's a very long story. So it's very difficult to start my an entry point. But I would like to start from the early 2000s, when Nepal went through a civil war between then Royal Nepal Army and the People's Liberation Army, led by the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist. And then that lasted for 10 years, from 1996 to 2006. We have lost so many lives, and thousands of people were disappeared, tortured, raped, and displaced from their locations. And also, I also personally suffered. So I myself a victim, survivor, activist, and practitioners. And at one point, my father was also arrested by the security forces, and then disappeared from the police custody and never have seen again. And so that's my personal story. And I myself recall and ask many times, what happens when someone is lost, lost not to death or relocation, but to enforced disappearance. And how do other families and survivors cope such suffering without answer, without justice, and without tracing their whereabouts? And so these questions have been part of my personal stories for many years. And so that's why I started a very local level activism, from the grassroots. And then I expanded my network, and then I practically or emotionally entered into this human rights field.
It's a fascinating story, Ram. I mean, the personal journey that you've been on is something that I haven't come across personally with anybody else in the field. At what point did you decide to take your important grassroots work and your important national work in Nepal and move into academia? Was that an organic decision, or were you suddenly struck with the desire to work in academia as well?
It's like an organic process, I would say. And then at the beginning, I'm not from the human rights field, or I have no idea about this transitional justice or other approaches that how conflict victims and survivors can receive justice, or can fulfill their desires and expectations, and by and activating in the grassroots activism, and then I felt some sort of power, some sort of agency and solidarity, and then within the group and mobilization of the family members around my communities. And then I felt that we need to have some sort of representation where there are many families and survivors. They have no voices. They cannot speak out. They cannot protest, and then they cannot convey their message to the authorities. And then I felt that, and then I and my group must represent the voices like many families, and that way we developed and expanded our small group initiatives into organized family associations. And then we felt that we need to develop a sort of national network as a solidarity movement, and then we linked it with the wider human rights movement and becoming a key actors in the transitional justice advocacy by doing and by learning. That's the product of the suffering, and also that's the product of the family mobilization as a representation of the wider families around the country. That way I started national activism, and then in the later phase I even moved and beyond enforced disappearances, including other serious human rights violations. And then I felt that from the very grassroots to regional to national level, solidarity is a kind of very powerful tool to advocate and these issues, and also to impact in the national policies and practices, to lobby for the family agenda on behalf of the wider family members and survivors agenda. And then I also build some links and network in the South Asia region, and within the network of the families of the disappeared. And then later I also linked with some memory activists, where memory is a very powerful tool for advocacy for the victims and survivors. And then I also and had some exposure in the international conferences, and then also I met with some academics doing research around this area, enforced disappearances, human rights violation, transitional justice, and transformative justice. And then I also developed some sort of ideas that different narratives I found were not connected with the victims and survivors approach. And then at some point I thought that maybe we need to develop some narratives. We need to build some victim-based narratives, and then we need to produce some victims' knowledge from the ground. And then where we need to tell the wider world. I thought that the world even has not done enough so far to acknowledge the suffering of the victims and survivors, or to listen their voices. So these are very important to build victim-based narratives. That way I was interested in academia, in terms of knowledge building and then production of victims' knowledge and narratives. And another thing was I was also interested to expand this the international solidarity, and represented by purely by the victims and survivors. That way I was motivated in both in academia and practices.
It's a really fascinating approach. We hear a lot in our field about doing work from the bottom up and focusing on victims' epistemologies, but in actual fact it doesn't occur all that often, which is what I've always found very interesting about discussing these issues with you, but also listening to you present your work as well, is that we need to do more to make sure that victims' voices actually inform our work. So in that respect, well, actually, I picked out a little quote that you once spoke. The solution is always at the local level, but that informs the work at the national and international levels. Now, I think here you're talking about activism at the international level, but I think that also goes to informing policymakers as well. How do you work not only within Nepal, but also with INOVAS to communicate the views of victims to policymakers and other important stakeholders in the transitional justice field?
Yeah, I mean, this is very important and tricky questions. As you said, that I also believe that a solution is always local. And then we need to localize transitional justice, and then we need to mobilize victims to address their local needs. These are always in the heart of transitional justice. But I mean, there are some powerful actors, and then outside the victims' constituencies, those who set agenda of transitional justice, those who drive the policies and lead the process. And so I think there are clear gaps and tensions between victims and the powerful donors or powerful states or the powerful actors externally. So that's why we need to convey grassroots and victims' message to the donors and state authorities and external actors, those who set the agenda. That's why we need to educate them. We need to lobby for the victim-centered policies. And so that's why we play a role in between to bring grassroots victims agenda to the policymakers and the other powerful actors, and also to influence them in policy making through victims' participation, victims' inclusion, and to recognize their role in the processes. And we were very much interested and now very much active in the international policy platforms, through conveying messages to the international actors, including the United Nations, regional bodies like European Union, African Union, and the donors, because they have resources. Victims have agency, and so that's why we need to link victims agency and the resources. Also, many victims in the ground, they argue that their spaces have been stolen. So that's why and we are also repowering victims and strengthening victims' movement through mobilization and policy lobbying. And these are important tools. That's why in the international level now, we are very much engaged on the victim participation, and then reparation policies and victims inclusion in the policy levels. And they are working with the different actors, and then to increase the role of victims.
It's fascinating. So in that respect, INOVAS is not only a victim representative body, but it's also a conduit between policymakers and academia as well, and victims themselves. So INOVAS doesn't just represent victims, but it empowers them.
And also this is important, INOVAS plays a role as a solidarity network that also brings policymakers, academics, and practitioners together. But it's an important element is this network, or let's say movement or international mobilization, is purely led by victims and survivors, where they can not only represent the grassroots voices, they also influence policymakers and produce knowledge and educate the global policy actors.
If I may jump in for a second, thank you so much, Ram, for talking about the philosophy behind INOVAS, the kinds of activities that you describe, and the emphasis on agency. I think is really important to understand well. Would you say these are aspects of transformative justice, as it's sometimes called, rather than transitional justice? And how would it fundamentally be different from transitional justice in the broad sense of the word?
I think from a victims and survivors' perspectives, in practice, transitional justice itself gives the meaning of transformation. And then they argue that they always want transformation in their lives. And also they want to address their daily needs. And this conventional transitional justice must be transformative. And transformative justice should address victims' daily needs and suffering to transform them as a political actors with respect and dignity. Survivors have been transformed by action. Like, I think mobilization itself are transformative, and victims' movement and itself as a transformative. And then we also support their mobilization. And so the mobilization is very important for all victim groups all over the world. Through their mobilization, they often transform by their action. And they produce their own leaders. And they produce some sort of internal healing mechanism. And they heal in a group. And they support each other. And so that's why we also support the peer support, peer support activities. And then sometimes like a self-help approach, they also grow them together. So our roots is the mobilization. Solidarity is our DNA. So that's why we also mobilize for the policy lobby. And also at the same time, we also build our capacities and knowledge. And also we also produce some our own narratives. That's why I also encourage many academics, and also I'm also becoming part of an academic practitioner's world. And then where I can convince and encourage other scholars to produce more victims' knowledge. And it's already a transnational movement. And our representatives, local victims and survivors groups, they are very grounded in all continents. And so this is our power of agency. And also I would not only say, I would identify myself as an international locals. Our INOVAS leaders term themselves as international locals. We are locally grounded and represent our voices and lobby for the national processes and also mobilize our national campaign. And also we represent and then also we intervene in the global policy platforms. So that's why we are seeking for international agency now. I would say transnational agency. So these are important in our global movement of justice. The big actors and external experts, they rarely ask what does justice mean for victims and survivors. This is not only legal or international. This must be local and transformative. It must bring all actors together, but led by victims and survivors in the ground.
That's really interesting. And would you say that there are specific aspects of transitional justice that are more prone, more open to transformation?
I think so. Memory is becoming a fifth pillar, which is very much connected with victims and survivors. And so many victims and survivors organizations, they are very much involved and leading the localizing of memory processes, and then they themselves commemorate, remember their disappeared relatives and the other victims of atrocities. And so memorialization is very much linked with dignity process also, and then where do they stand and their role is counted in their particular context. So that's why and prevention also is another pillar beyond institutional reform and things. So that's why I think these are very much interrelated, and also that also brings some intersectionality between the actors and communities. Even before beginning of the transitional justice process, there are some issues of memorialization, reparation, and transformation already happening. So I think these are already progressive. So that's why I would like to say this process is a transformative transitional justice.
That's an interesting combination. Okay, good. Over to you, James.
Excellent. So within the INOVAS acronym, the N is really the letter we need to emphasize, and that's the network. INOVAS is a network. It is not a body that makes all the decisions for victims. It is a body, or it is a network of victims, which is why I think it's such an important actor within the transitional or transformative transitional justice space. Just before we finish up, Ram, I want to just delve into some of your expertise on disappearances. Can you discuss the kinds of effects that the phenomenon of enforced disappearance has on victims' families, and the process of trying to transform out of that event?
Yeah, it's a very difficult and very emotional for all families, from the let's say in the 1970s in Latin America, let's say in Argentina and Guatemala too. And then today's in Ukraine and in Gaza war, people still are suffering. And also in my case, from 2000 there, and also there are some members in our network from Lebanon to DRC to Nigeria to all over the world. There, I think, real suffer, so there are many, families left behind. So that's why I already questioned that. How do these, families left behind cope with these circumstances and move on? And so that is one of the inspirational, motivational factor for all the victims and survivors. These are very important. And then why nobody gives an answer. I also never imagined that how long this fight would be. But it's many years now, and then I'm still fighting, and there are many others, fellow, friends and our activist colleagues in all over the world that are still fighting for justice and truth. And so it's very emotional, psychological. There are many families suffering through mental health, and some disappointments, anger, and frustration. But in the moment, I believe that we need to save and protect anger and frustration also to strengthen our movement, and these are important. It's a tragedy, family tragedy, and so it's like a long journey, and the fight is very hard. So we are fighting against the powerful states. We are fighting against the powerful actors, and victims and survivors are. They don't have resources, they have limited space, and even some spaces have been stolen, have been hijacked by the powerful actors. So that's why we are regaining our agency through mobilization, through movement, and solidarity discourses, let's say, bringing academia and practitioners together, and also conveying these messages, victims' voices, and also knowledge produced in the field to the policymakers. So I think we need to advance such solidarity discourses all over the world in all contexts. So that's why the value of knowledge is very important in terms of producing new narratives and also decentralize the state-led narratives. I often think and then feel that, and one day we'll receive some answer and justice, and I'm always optimistic. And that, I dream of a world without disappearance.
Can't be put much better than that.
Yes, absolutely. What else can you say to hear this from your mouth, let's say? You need a lot of courage and a lot of determination, and still keeping that positive outlook. That's a very difficult task, and very challenging, it seems to us, but one that is also very important. So I'd like to thank you very much for this talk and sharing your insights, and wishing you all the best with your work and with INOVAS as a network as well.
Thank you very much.